Close your eyes and imagine endless plains stretching to the very horizon. Tall grass sways slowly in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of a massive herd of bison can be heard. A caravan of covered wagons moves slowly along a narrow path. People have left their homes and set off into the unknown. They do not yet know that mountains, deserts, harsh winters, water shortages, and trials that will change them forever await them ahead. This is exactly how the true story of the Wild West begins. When this period is mentioned today, most people immediately imagine cowboys, revolvers, saloons, and quick duels in the middle of a dusty street. But the reality was quite different. The Wild West was not just a place. It was a vast territory that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. It encompassed endless prairies, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the hot deserts of Arizona, the dense forests of Oregon, and the fertile valleys of California. At the beginning of the 19th century, most of these lands remained almost unknown to Americans. There were no large cities, railroads, or modern roads here. Instead, dozens of indigenous peoples lived here, who for many centuries had perfectly adapted to life in these harsh conditions. The Comanche were considered some of the best horsemen of their time. The Sioux controlled vast expanses of the Great Plains. The Apache masterfully survived among rocky deserts, and the Navajo created a unique culture that has survived to this day. For each tribe, this land was home long before the first settlers from the east appeared here. At the beginning of the 19th century, the United States was a very young nation. Most of the population lived far to the east of the country, and the Western territories seemed like an almost boundless, unknown world. In 1803, an event occurred that changed the history of America. President Thomas Jefferson purchased a vast territory from France, known as the Louisiana Purchase. The country's area almost doubled. However, no one knew for sure what exactly the new lands were hiding. To find the answer, an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark was organized. In 1804, a small group of explorers set out on the journey. They faced a difficult task: to explore the new territories, draw maps, describe plants and animals, and find a possible route to the Pacific Ocean. The journey lasted over 2 years. During this time, the expedition traveled thousands of kilometers through rivers, forests, and mountains. They encountered unfamiliar tribes, saw huge herds of bison, grizzly bears, wolves, and elk. For many participants, this was their first encounter with nature, so grand that it seemed boundless. A young woman from the Shoshone tribe, Sacagawea, played a special role in this expedition. She helped find safe routes and acted as an interpreter during negotiations with tribes and repeatedly saved the expedition from hunger and danger. Today, her name is considered one of the symbols of the development of the American West. The maps created by Lewis and Clark opened the way for thousands of people. Soon, one of the largest migrations in the history of the United States began. Families sold their farms, left cities, and set out on a months-long journey. All their property fit into one covered wagon. Thousands of kilometers of road lay ahead. One of the most famous routes became the Oregon Trail. Its length exceeded 3,000 kilometers. The journey often took from 4 to 6 months. People crossed wide rivers without bridges, overcame rocky mountain passes, endured dust storms, cholera epidemics, and a lack of drinking water. According to historians, thousands of settlers never reached their final destination. Their graves were often left right by the side of the road. Despite the danger, the flow of people only grew. Many believed in the so-called manifest destiny, a popular idea at the time that the United States should stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. For some, it was a political doctrine. For others, it was a dream of a new life, their own land, and a better fate. While settlers moved west, nature remained the true master of these spaces. Endless plains were covered by millions of bison. Some contemporaries wrote that a herd could move for so long that it took several hours to pass. According to rough estimates, by the mid-19th century, more than 30 million bison lived on the Great Plains. They were the foundation of life for many Indian tribes. Bison provided meat, hides, bones, tendons, and even fuel. Almost every part of the animal found its use. For the indigenous peoples, it was not just prey, but an integral part of their culture and way of life. However, very soon this world would begin to change. The discovery of gold, the construction of the railroad, the appearance of new cities and huge ranches would forever transform the Wild West. Along with them, the image of the cowboy would be born, a person who would later become one of the most famous symbols of American history. But were cowboys really the way Hollywood portrays them? By the mid-19th century, the American West was already changing rapidly. Thousands of settlers arrived every year, but the real turning point was the discovery of gold in California in 1848. The news spread across the country with incredible speed. It seemed as if the whole world was suddenly talking about one place. Farmers left their fields. Sailors abandoned their ships. Craftsmen, doctors, merchants, and even teachers set out on the road, hoping to find gold and get rich. Thousands of people traveled thousands of kilometers just for a few handfuls of precious metal. But it very quickly became clear that not everyone found gold. In fact, the greatest fortunes were often made not by gold miners, but by those who sold them shovels, pickaxes, tents, food, and clothing. It was then that young entrepreneur Levi Strauss began selling durable canvas pants for miners. A few years later, they became the world-famous Levi's jeans. While California was experiencing the gold rush, cattle ranching was developing rapidly on the Great Plains. It was here that the profession of a cowboy was born. Modern cinema has created an image of a fearless gunslinger who participates in shootouts every day. In reality, a cowboy's life was much calmer and significantly harder. His workday began before dawn. It was necessary to feed the horses, check the herd, find lost calves, repair fences, and drive thousands of head of cattle to railway stations. Sometimes the drive lasted 2 or 3 months. During this time, cowboys traveled hundreds of kilometers under the scorching sun, got caught in thunderstorms, dust storms, and endured dangerous river crossings. The greatest fear was the so-called stampede, a panic-stricken flight of the herd. A clap of thunder, lightning, or an unexpected noise was enough for thousands of frightened bulls to rush forward at once. Cowboys risked their lives trying to stop a multi-ton herd that swept away everything in its path. Despite the popular image, a revolver was far from the main tool of a cowboy. Much more important were the lasso, knife, saddle, and horse. Most cowboys never participated in a real shootout in their entire lives. Their profession resembled hard physical labor more than an adventure movie. It is interesting that approximately 1 in 4 cowboys was African American, and Mexicans and representatives of indigenous peoples also worked as herders. Hollywood for a long time barely showed this diversity, although it was a characteristic feature of the real West. Along with the settlers, conflicts with Indian tribes arose more and more often. For the U.S. government, the development of new lands meant the development of the country. For indigenous peoples, it meant the loss of hunting grounds, their traditional way of life, and freedom. One of the most famous events was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. General George Custer's troops met the combined forces of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The battle ended in a crushing defeat for the American army. For the Indian tribes, it was a great victory. However, it could not change the general course of history. Within a few years, most tribes were forced to move to reservations. The last great leader of the resistance was Geronimo, the leader of the Apache. His small detachment avoided pursuit by the American army for years, using their knowledge of the deserts and mountains. In 1886, Geronimo surrendered. For many historians, this event symbolizes the end of the Indian Wars. Meanwhile, the country continued to change. In 1869, the construction of the first transcontinental railroad was completed. It became one of the greatest engineering achievements of its time. Now, the journey from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean took not months, but only a few days. Along with the railroad came the telegraph. News that previously traveled for weeks was now transmitted in a matter of minutes. The Wild West gradually ceased to be wild. Real cities emerged on the site of temporary camps. Banks, schools, hospitals, and courts appeared. Laws became stronger than revolvers. It was during this period that stories about legendary lawmen and outlaws were born. Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Doc Holliday, Jesse James, they all really existed. However, many myths eventually arose around their biographies. For example, the famous shootout at the OK Corral lasted less than a minute. And most towns actually banned carrying loaded weapons in the center even before the advent of modern police. It was Hollywood that significantly exaggerated the number of duels and shootouts. In real life, sheriffs dealt much more often with cattle rustling, fraud, or family conflicts than with spectacular gunfights. By the end of the 19th century, the era of the Wild West was gradually coming to an end. Endless prairies were being divided by fences. Railroads connected the country into a single system. Huge herds of bison had almost disappeared. Modern cities grew on the sites of small settlements. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially announced that the American frontier no longer existed. This date is considered the symbolic end of the Wild West era. However, its legacy has not disappeared anywhere. It remained in films, novels, music, museums, and national parks. And although the real Wild West was much more complex than Westerns showed, it was this era that formed one of the most famous symbols of American history. And perhaps the main lesson of the Wild West is not in stories about revolvers or chases. It reminds us that any development of new lands brings not only opportunities, but also difficult challenges. It is a story of human courage, hard work, great discoveries, and difficult decisions, the consequences of which are felt even today. When we look at modern Western cities, Denver, Phoenix, Dallas, San Francisco, or Los Angeles, it is hard to imagine that just a century and a half ago, most of these lands were almost unexplored. But that is exactly what makes the history of the Wild West so fascinating. It reminds us how quickly the world can change and how legends are born from real human stories.